The auditorium of the Global Leadership Forum in Geneva was buzzing, press, delegates, students, veterans of diplomacy, all there to see the return of Barack Obama to the world stage. Once hailed as the architect of hope, his every word used to command reverence. But this time, the air carried a strange tension. Because seated in the second row, silent and calm, was Captain Ibrahim Traoré. Obama entered with his trademark smile and graceful nods. He scanned the audience, his voice echoing through the hall, "It's good to be back among those shaping the future." Applause followed, but Traoré didn't clap. He simply looked forward, expression unmoved. Then came the moment. Obama's tone sharpened, veering from hopeful to accusatory. "Some of you," he said, turning slightly toward Traoré without naming him, "seem to believe that leadership comes from defiance, not wisdom. From provocation, not diplomacy. But I ask, who do you think you are?" The hall went still. Cameras zoomed in. All eyes shifted to the man in the brown military uniform, hands clasped calmly on his lap. Traoré stood, not rushed, not dramatic, but deliberate. The silence cracked like thunder as he took the mic, and with eyes locked on Obama, he answered. "I am the future you feared." The air seemed to thin. Traoré's voice was deep, unshaken. "You came to Africa with smiles and drones. You gave speeches about progress while funding wars. You built bases, not bridges. You offered aid with one hand and stole resources with the other. And when we rose, when we finally said, 'No more,' you called us threats to order." He scanned the room, pausing on diplomats and donors alike. "You fear us because we are no longer begging for a seat. We're flipping the table." Obama's face stiffened, not in anger, but recognition. Traoré leaned closer to the mic. "You asked who I am. I'm the voice of those your policies buried. I'm the return of justice you thought would never come." And with that, he handed the mic back and sat down. The crowd didn't cheer. They didn't boo. They just sat, frozen, questioning, shaken. Because for the first time, a man they thought untouchable had been answered, without apology. The silence that followed Traoré's declaration wasn't ordinary. It wasn't the kind of silence that follows a dramatic moment. It was a rupture. An unplanned pause in the tempo of global diplomacy. Obama sat back slowly, eyes fixed not on the crowd, but on the man who had just redefined the space he once dominated. The moderators looked at each other, unsure whether to resume the panel or call for a break. But the audience remained still, many blinking as if waking from a trance. It wasn't just what Traoré had said, it was what he'd dared to say in front of the man who once symbolized liberal global leadership. Obama finally spoke, low and measured. "You've got fire, Captain," he said. "But leadership is more than fire. It's the patience to build, the restraint not to destroy." Traoré didn't look away. "Then why did you build prisons instead of schools in Djibouti? Why did restraint mean drone strikes over Somalia, silence over Congo, and loyalty to tyrants across West Africa?" The words weren't shouted. They didn't need to be. Each one landed like a verdict. Journalists scrambled to capture every phrase. Live streams were flooded. Social media exploded. In Washington, Paris, Nairobi, screens lit up with the confrontation. Obama shifted in his seat. "It's easy to judge from the outside," he countered. "But governing means compromise. Complexity." Traoré stood again, not to attack, but to make one thing clear. Compromise is when both sides lose something. Africa lost blood. The West gained gold. That's not complexity. That's conquest. This time, murmurs swept through the room, gasps, whispered translations, even subtle nods from African diplomats who had long stayed quiet. And Traoré didn't stop. "We don't want applause. We want accountability. We don't need your validation. We need our land, our dignity, our future, without chains dressed as treaties." The moderators finally stepped in to break the tension. "Let's move forward," one said nervously. But the room had already moved. It had moved toward a new center of gravity, and Traoré was sitting at its core. Obama straightened his jacket and leaned forward, the diplomatic smile still resting on his face, but it no longer reached his eyes. "And what would you do, Captain Traore?" he asked. "If you had the power, would you lead with justice, or become what you claim to resist?" Traore raised a brow, just slightly. "I already lead, Mr. President. I don't need your approval to validate it." The room again rippled with tension. This wasn't a debate, it was an unmasking. Obama, usually the master of composed rhetoric, found himself grasping for the upper hand. Revolution is easy when you're shouting from the outside. Inside the machine, you realize how hard it is to change anything. "And yet you never tried to break the machine," Traore answered. "You oiled it, smiled through it, branded it as hope." That word, hope, carried weight. It had once been the banner of a generation. But now, in Traore's voice, it sounded hollow. "Reclaimed. You inspired millions," Traore continued, "but not to act, to wait. And while they waited, deals were made, soldiers were sent, and Africa was bought piece by piece." Obama's smile faded. His advisors glanced toward the exit, visibly uncomfortable. "You claim to understand Africa," Traore said, "but what you understand is colonial diplomacy, how to speak softly while pressing your boot down." There were gasps now, some stifled, some bold. Cameras zoomed. The moment was live across the world. And then, Traore leaned closer, voice lower, but unmistakably clear. "We are not the shadows of your legacy. We are the fire it feared." Obama sat silent. Not because he had no words, but because, for the first time, someone had spoken the truth to his face, and the world heard it louder than any speech he had ever given. The hall didn't breathe. No cough, no shuffle of feet, not even the hum of air conditioning dared to interrupt the silence that followed Traore's words. The world had just watched a former U.S. president, Barack Obama, the man once called a global symbol of grace and intelligence, be rendered speechless. And not by another superpower. By a soldier from a continent they thought they'd forgotten how to fear. Obama finally inhaled, slow and controlled. "You speak with passion, Captain," he said. "But passion without patience burns everything, even your own house." Traore didn't flinch. "Then let it burn," he said. "If the house was built on slavery, bribes, and silence, then yes, I'd rather it burn than keep sleeping inside it." The cameras captured everything, the fury in Obama's flickering eyes, the unwavering stillness of Traore, the flash of realization across global delegates who'd expected fireworks, but not this kind of fire. "You think the world will follow you?" Obama said, his tone softening into something more desperate than commanding. "That these people here," he gestured across the room of leaders, "will abandon diplomacy and pick up a torch with you?" "They already have," Traore replied. "Not because I asked. Because you failed." There was no shouting. Just two men, each holding the weight of their world, locked in a quiet, brutal truth. Obama had entered the room as a symbol of what was once possible. But Traore? He stood as the proof of what was now inevitable. And the eyes watching across every screen, every phone, every television knew, they had just witnessed a moment history wouldn't forget. Obama stepped back, just slightly, barely noticeable to some, but to Traore, it was confirmation. A leader who once moved crowds with words was now retreating under their weight. The audience sensed it too. Cameras zoomed in. Analysts around the world leaned forward. Something was unraveling. "You speak as if history began with you," Obama said, voice firm but faltering at the edges. "But this world was shaped by compromise, by structure, by domination." Traore cut in sharply, his voice now filling the entire chamber without the need to raise it. "Structure built by chains. Compromise written in blood. You call it diplomacy. We remember it as theft." The room crackled, not with noise, but with tension. The kind that tightened every throat, held every blink in midair. Delegates glanced at each other, unsure whether to admire Traore's audacity or fear what it meant for the future. Obama tried to regain ground. You don't win by burning bridges, Captain. I'm not here to cross bridges built on corpses, Traore shot back. I'm here to build new ones, with those willing to walk beside us, not in front. The words struck harder than any threat. Because they weren't just aimed at Obama, they were aimed at everyone in power who had mistaken Africa's silence for submission. Traore didn't just reject the old game. He flipped the board, scattered the pieces, and lit the table on fire. And still, he stood calm, shoulders straight, eyes focused, hands steady. Because he wasn't trying to prove himself anymore. He was already rewriting the rules. The silence that followed was not one of respect, it was anticipation. Obama, once the global embodiment of measured diplomacy, now stood across from a man who carried storms behind his eyes. But the former president wasn't finished. You believe fire is the future? Obama asked, his tone sharpening. You mistake noise for leadership. We built systems, not perfect, but stable. You threaten to tear them all down. Traore's expression didn't change. But his words struck with quiet thunder. You built prisons and called them systems. You locked out voices like mine and called it peace. You traded justice for comfort, truth for order. And now you're afraid of what happens when the voices you ignored no longer ask to be heard, they demand it. Across the hall, the air turned thick. Delegates shifted uneasily in their seats. Some looked to Obama for calm, others to Traore for courage. The two men, a continent and a generation apart, stood as opposites, one a symbol of what was, the other a sign of what's coming. Obama stepped forward, breaking the invisible line between them. Leadership isn't about rage. It's about responsibility. If you think power is the answer, you'll become what you hate. I'm not here for power, Traore replied. I'm here for balance. And if shaking the foundation is what it takes to make room for justice, so be it. If that makes the old world nervous, maybe it's time they felt what we've lived with for centuries, fear. Those last words didn't echo, they detonated. The hall held its breath, but Traore didn't wait for their approval. He turned to face the world, not just the man behind him. And in that moment, he wasn't just confronting Obama. He was confronting every empire disguised as diplomacy. Obama stood motionless, but something in his eyes shifted, a flicker of recognition, or perhaps regret. He had once been the future, a beacon of progress to a world suffocating under its own weight. Now, that same world stared at him and saw a relic. And before him stood a man with dust from revolutions on his boots and the blood of colonized ancestors in his voice. You think justice is loud, Obama said, this time softer, as if trying to reach a younger version of himself. But sometimes it whispers. Sometimes it builds. You burn too quickly, Traore. The world will burn with you. Traore stepped forward, slowly, with the steadiness of a man who had seen the ruins and chosen to build from them. I've seen what your silence builds. Children buried beneath rubble. Minds stripped bare while schools stay empty. Armies funded in the name of peace. You want me to whisper? Whispering is for those who still believe someone's listening. The room held its breath again, as if afraid any sound might crack the floor beneath them. Obama opened his mouth, but no words came. Traore didn't wait. You taught the world to hope, Traore continued. But hope without power is cruelty. It gives people dreams they're never allowed to reach. You gave speeches. We give land, food, dignity. You worked for votes. We work for survival. A ripple spread through the audience. Some delegates looked at Obama with unease, others at Traore with awe. The old guard was cracking, not from violence, but from relevance. For the first time in his political life, Obama had no answer. Not because he had none, but because even he knew. The future had stopped asking for permission. Obama sat down. The silence thundered louder than any applause. Around him, delegates shifted, some in discomfort, others in quiet satisfaction. The weight of Traoré's words hung like a storm cloud, not passing, but growing heavier with every second. But Traoré wasn't finished. He turned away from the stage and looked directly into the cameras broadcasting to the world. "This isn't just about Africa," he said, voice steady. "It's about every nation that was told they'd be free, if they followed rules written in Washington, in Paris, in London. We followed. And we died." The screens across the assembly lit up, images of drone strikes in Mali, starving children in refugee camps, scorched earth where gold used to gleam. One after another, the tragedies of the global south flooded the walls of the UN, and suddenly, hope looked a lot like hunger in a suit. "You call it democracy," Traoré continued. "But every time we vote for dignity, you sanction us. Every time we stand up, you cut us down. You want leaders like Obama, quiet, polished, fluent in your language and blind to your crimes." A gasp echoed through the room. Obama, still seated, looked up slowly, his expression unreadable, somewhere between shame and something deeper, perhaps the realization that the man in front of him had not come to debate, but to end the illusion. Traoré took one final step toward the center of the hall. "Barack," he said calmly, "your legacy was built on speeches. Mine will be built on truth. And truth, when it rises, burns the empire that tried to bury it." The hall erupted, not with applause, but with silence. The kind of silence that follows revelation. The kind that doesn't ask what comes next, because it already knows. Nothing will be the same. Obama didn't respond. For a man who once moved nations with eloquence, who filled stadiums with hope and headlines with poetry, now, he sat frozen. Not because he lacked words, but because the words had finally turned against him. And Traoré stood there, not smiling, not gloating, only standing. Like a mountain unshaken by the wind. Across the room, Western diplomats glanced at each other nervously. Some reached for earpieces, others for their pens, all of them realizing, this wasn't just a speech. It was a declaration. Not of war. But of irrelevance. "The world is shifting," Traoré said, voice softer now but no less sharp. "We no longer ask for a seat at your table. We are building our own." The phrase lingered. He wasn't begging for recognition. He was dismissing it. From the back of the hall, an African delegate rose in quiet defiance. Then a Caribbean leader. Then a Southeast Asian representative. Slowly, like dominoes refusing to fall, they stood, not for applause, not for protest, but for alignment. With Traoré. With truth. And with the fury of centuries demanding reckoning. Obama looked around and saw something he hadn't faced in his career, not opposition, but replacement. The stage he once owned was now held by a man the world once overlooked, and now couldn't ignore. Traoré didn't look back as he left the podium. He didn't have to. Because for the first time, history wasn't waiting for America to act. It was moving forward without it. Outside the United Nations, the air crackled with a different kind of energy. Not from protests or parades, but from awakening. Journalists scrambled, live streams exploded with comments, and social media burned with one message. "Did you hear what Traoré said to Obama?" Inside the chamber, the silence still lingered. Not awkward. Not empty. Heavy. As if something sacred had just shifted. As if a spell had broken. Obama remained seated, hands clasped, his gaze unfocused. He had once been the symbol of what a changing world could look like, a black man in the White House, an icon of diplomacy, charisma, and hope. But now, in Traoré's presence, that legacy felt borrowed. Safe. Sanitized. And worse, outdated. Traoré had not spoken with polish. He had spoken with pain. Not to flatter the West, but to warn it. Not to make history, but to correct it. As he stepped into the daylight, dozens of microphones chased him. Reporters shouted his name, begging for a soundbite, a headline, a second spark. He gave them a single sentence. The future doesn't wait for permission. Then he walked on. But behind him, entire governments began to shift their tone. Alliances were questioned. Aid deals renegotiated. Old partnerships strained. And the Global South, so often spoken for, began, finally, to speak back. In Dakar, murals of Traore were painted overnight. In Rio, student protests carried his quotes on banners. In Harlem, an elder whispered to his grandson, "That man just changed everything." Even in Washington, aides scrambled to draft responses, while presidents sat in quiet rage, realizing power had moved. Obama once represented possibility. Traore now embodied inevitability. And from that moment forward, every global conversation would carry his voice echoing through it. Not as a visitor, but as the future that spoke back.